Welcome back, everybody. So today I'm going to make a video on when we should be using RFS and RMB. So why is this coming up? Well, a few of my colleagues have expressed frustration in the lack of emphasis on when RFS is appropriate in GD&T training. Most courses focus on when to use things like MMC and LMC, but RFS isn't often discussed other than mentioning that it's the default. For example, someone who's taken a GD&T course could probably look at this assembly, which, maybe this inside bit is pressurized, it's located with dowels and then bolted down and sealed up. They could probably look at this and say that, well, there's a potential thin wall condition happening between these dowels and this inner cavity. So an LMC on the inner cavity is probably appropriate, and then they'd look at the outside and say, well, this is trying to fit inside another part, so probably MMC is appropriate. But most training wouldn't, it would not highlight when RFS is the correct choice, other than maybe, saying if it's not one of those two, just go with RFS. So I think I'm going to try to address a couple situations where RFS makes sense in this video. So to start, what is RFS? Stands for, of course, regardless of feature size, and it's been the default material condition since the 1994 standard. It's commonly known as rule number 2. And with RFS, the geometric control maintains its assigned tolerance zone regardless of the feature size, compared to MMC or LMC, which the tolerance zone is changed depending on the feature or size, whether, the size grows or shrinks. It may grow or, you get bonus tolerance. So the first example I'm going to go over is, some sort of assembly. We've got two housings or two similar housings that have a bearing pressed into them, and then a shaft runs on the bearing. Maybe through, previous knowledge or math, we decide that a positional error on this bearing bore of 50 microns is appropriate, and if we keep it below that or at that, the bearings will survive the service life. Anything above that and the service life will be reduced. So the steps that I'll go through are, I'll look at, does it make sense to use MMC? Does it make sense to use LMC? And if not, I'll usually go with RFS, and then I'll go over the sort of the shortcut that I use now that I'm a little bit more experienced. But let's address LMC first. Does it make sense to use LMC? Well, there's not really a thin wall condition that we're trying to protect, so I think we can just throw LMC out right away. But MMC is a little bit, it's a bit more interesting. So let's explore what this would look like with an MMC material modifier. So let's say we do 50 microns at maximum material condition. That means that when this comes in at the maximum material condition, a part would get rejected above 50 microns of positional error, so that means this part should come in okay. However, if it comes in at its least material size tolerance, we would accept up to a positional error of 72 microns, which would reduce the service life if our math is to be believed. So that's no good. But we're intelligent. We say, okay, well, let's say that when it comes in and it's at LMC size, we actually have that 50 micron positional tolerance. So that means that we reduce the maximum material positional tolerance to 28 microns. So in both cases, or in all cases, if the part's inspected correctly, we should have parts that will survive the entire service life. Now this is great. However, it also means that if something comes in at its maximum material condition and a positional error of 50 microns, we're scrapping that part, even though from our math we know that it would actually survive the service life cycle and it would be a good performing part. So that's kind of annoying because now we're just throwing away good parts. So in conclusion, I would say MMC is not the right choice because it either accepts parts that will not work or it rejects parts that will work. So RFS is probably the correct choice. So in general, the shortcut that I've come up with for RFS is when a part interaction involves material deformation, RFS is usually the correct choice. So things like press fits, bearings and dowels, anything with like a spring pin dowel, and even like elastic polymers and O-rings. If there's an interaction where there's some sort of material deformation happening, RFS is probably a good place to start. There's going to be times where this is not the case, but in general, I've found this to be true. So let's look at a second example. This is going to be looking more at RMB. So let's say we've got an assembly where we've got some sort of housing, and then a cap is inserted with an O-ring, and then we bolt it down with some cap screws. So in this case, the datum A's, or the primary datums for both parts, is going to be the faces, and then the secondary datums are going to be something like the bore and the shaft. So does it make sense if we were to come up with a positional tolerance zone for these cap screws? Does it make sense to have B at a material modifier? I think we can throw out LMB right away because there's no wall thicknesses being maintained or anything like that. But does MMB make sense? And I would argue no, because as this datum B bore grows, as it goes towards its least material condition, the cap is still going to center itself because this O-ring is going to look for some sort of lowest energy situation, which is going to be equal compression on all sides of the O-ring. So in this case, the positional tolerance zone should be B at RMB. Just a question to sort of wrap things up. In this O-ring example, what would the appropriate datum be for this cap part be? Would it be the shaft, which has a nominal gap to the bore? Or is it the diameter of the O-ring groove? Because the O-ring, sort of as we discussed, is doing the actual centering. We could force this cap off of the center line and overcome the O-ring, but in general, it's really going to want to try and stay there. So where would you put the datum B? Anyways, have a good one.